Tamar Foster is the Deputy Executive Director at the California's Little Hoover Commission. The commission is America's only permanent independent citizens commission working to improve state government. On behalf of the commission, in 2020, Tamar authored a series of 3 reports that highlighted the state's efforts to combat human trafficking and showcased opportunities to more effectively identify and target labor trafficking. She currently heads the commission's work on law enforcement training. Previously, as senior project manager, she headed commission studies on creating a customer-centric government, geographic information systems, and the state's Veterans Homes Program, among other topics. She began her public service career as an executive fellow in the California Department of Health Services in 2007 and holds a master's degree in public policy and administration from California State University, Sacramento. Please join me in welcoming Tamar and her amazing team.
Thank you so much for having us here today. We're just really thrilled. I want to make sure that you can hear me and see me fine.
Yes. I can, yes.
Perfect, okay. Well, we've been in conversations about this event, this forum for months now, and so grateful to be here and so grateful for this opportunity really to talk about something that we found in California really isn't often talked about, and that is labor trafficking. So just briefly, I want to introduce our panel session. So you kind of have a sense of what our plan is. And really what we're going to do is just have each of our speakers, because you'll really want to learn from their work, have each of our speakers give a little bit of an overview of the work that they're doing. And then for about half of the session, we'll have more of an interactive question and answer session so that we can engage with you a little bit more and not just talk at you. So if we could go to the next slide. Let me begin by introducing my panelists, because really these are some amazing individuals in the work that we did as a commission. This group really stood out as innovators in California and pioneers who are really trying to figure out ways to address labor trafficking on the ground in the work and the day-to-day work that they do. So I'm very happy to introduce all of them to you. So first we have District Attorney Nancy O'Malley. DA O'Malley has served as Alameda County's Chief Law Enforcement Officer since 2009. She created the first human trafficking prosecution unit in California back in 2004, and her office prosecuted one of the first in the nation labor trafficking cases involving Asian workers in the construction industry. She founded the Human Exploitation and Trafficking, that's called HEAT, the HEAT Watch program, to unite law enforcement, service providers, and communities in the fight against trafficking. And she also created the Alameda County United Against Human Trafficking Advisory Committee, which includes a labor trafficking task force. She has written and sponsored legislation that strengthens California's laws to address both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So Nancy, thank you for being here with us today. Next, we have the team from the Sex and Trafficking Unit of the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. So this is headed by Truong, and he directs the unit and he's also drafted state legislation to expand state civil abatement laws to address human trafficking. This is some very innovative work. He uses these tools to file civil actions against motels for human trafficking violations. And he also has handled some of the first petitions to vacate a victim's prior arrests and convictions for violations that they were forced to commit while being trafficked. On his team is Rena Shahandeh. She is a deputy city attorney in the unit and has served as a prosecuting attorney in the criminal and civil branches of the city attorney's office for more than 20 years. She also has handled some of the first human trafficking vacature motions filed in Los Angeles. And finally, Cindy Martinez Lewis. She serves as a paralegal in the unit, where among other projects, she's responsible for administering the groundbreaking pre-filing diversion pilot program called Project Beacon, which was created by Ann and Rena to provide early screening for victims of human trafficking. I'd also like to note that this team co-chairs the LA Regional Human Trafficking Task Force's Labor Trafficking Subcommittee. It's a mouthful, but this Labor Trafficking Subcommittee is a really rare innovation. It's a collaboration of federal, state, county, local law enforcement, social service agencies, non-government agencies, and community-based organizations that are all working together to investigate the needs of human trafficking victims. And last but not least, on our panel, we have Panida Rzonca. She is the directing attorney at the Thai Community Development Center, or Thai CDC, where she oversees all direct social and legal services for Thai victims of human trafficking. So she's working with victims in the Los Angeles region where they're based, but really all over the country. So she counsels victims who are called upon to be witnesses in federal courts, as well as those in need of immigration services. She manages the delivery of comprehensive social services to victims, and she is a member of the California Access to Justice Commission and serves as co-chair of the Racial Justice and Intersectionality Committee. So I'm really pleased to have all of them here today with me. We could go to the next slide. I want to give you a little bit of background about the Little Hoover Commission because most people ask. We're a very small, unique organization that's part of California state government. We're independent and bipartisan, and our charge is to look at ways to make state government more efficient, more effective, and more responsive to Californians. So I work for a committee of commissioners who are appointed by the governor and legislative leaders to direct us as staff to pursue various topics. We started back in 2019 looking at human trafficking generally. We kind of wanted to survey, the state's landscapes to understand what California is doing to address human trafficking. What we quickly learned was that we had some tools and resources in place to address sex trafficking, but very little was known about labor trafficking. So we directed our efforts in this study on that. Our study process is a unique one. It's very open to the public. We often look for experts who are in the field. As staff, we work as generalists and study all kinds of government programs. So when we engage in our studies, we're reaching out to find people who are knowledgeable in the field. So with this study, we looked within California and really across the nation to involve people. We held 2 hearings that included survivors of labor trafficking, legal and scholarly experts, prosecutors, advocates. Really, we tried to catch the spectrum of folks involved. And we also held a really interesting roundtable down in Los Angeles, hosted by our city attorney colleagues, where we brought together about 50 people. And I have to say, part of the value of the work that we do is the process. So it's our public hearings that are raising awareness, but also these events like our roundtable that are creating opportunities to connect people who might not otherwise know each other or interact with each other. And they're able to find shared connections and interests and learn from each other. So that was part of the value of our work. And then if we go to the next slide, the other value of our work are the reports that we produce, and these live on our website. We'll share the links with you. This particular study resulted in 3 reports with recommendations for our governor and lawmaker about ways to do a better job and strengthen Californians' efforts in responding to labor trafficking. So today I'm just going to highlight very briefly the findings and recommendations from these reports, but I really would encourage you to pull them up. There's a lot of resources in there and people who might be good references if you're interested in learning more. So the next slide. So just to kind of paint the picture in the background a little bit, what we know about labor trafficking in California is really limited. That's probably similar for many of you in other states as well. Back in 2005, California made all forms of human trafficking a crime, but our response so far in terms of our policies, our funding, and really our attention to human trafficking has been focused on sex trafficking. And even within that, sex trafficking of minors. So very little attention has been paid to labor trafficking, with some minor pieces, some minor work that's done. but mostly we've worked on sex trafficking. So we don't have a lot of data. For our work at the commission, we found two great data sets. One was the national hotline data from Polaris that really looks at survivors that are coming up or reports of incidents of labor trafficking. And so that's one way we can kind of learn about the data. The other data source is California specific, and that is we fund in our Office of Emergency Services, we provide funding to victim service providers to help human trafficking victims. So this program that we have collects data broadly about human trafficking victims, but it does tell us a little bit about where labor trafficking victims are showing up. So now if we can go to the next slide. From these, data sources, we know a little bit about where it happens. Generally, research shows that California, just because of, our context with our massive coastline and our ports, I think we have some of the largest ports in the Western Hemisphere. We've got freeways that connect north and south, east and west, and connect us to international borders. We've got major airports and transit corridors. We have a diverse population, many languages spoken, and strong and robust industries in many different areas. So it's, much of this can lead to hiding trafficking or facilitating trafficking. But from the data, we learned that there are several industries in particular where labor trafficking occurs in California. And one is domestic trafficking, which can occur in folks' homes, in individual homes. But besides that, labor trafficking occurs in traveling sales crews, agriculture, restaurants, beauty, construction, and other industries that often, just look like normal work. As far as within the state, the data that we have, the state data shows that labor trafficking survivors are turning up for help in Los Angeles and in our Central Valley in Fresno and Sacramento. But really, there were 15 counties, 15 of our 58 counties received funding from that program, and all of them saw labor trafficking survivors. So what that tells us is that likely if we were asking service providers in other areas of the state to collect this data, we suspect that we might see labor trafficking survivors much more broadly throughout the state as well. And the next slide. So we do know a little bit about who is impacted. There's not one type of person who can fall prey to labor trafficking. From the national data, we know that most of the victims are prime working age, that's somewhere between 18 and 40. But we also know that there's not one type of person who would be a labor trafficking victim or target for labor trafficking. The California data that we have shows us that almost a quarter of the human trafficking survivors that are turning up for help in California are victims of labor trafficking. And this group, the data doesn't allow us to break it down by population, but this group of human trafficking survivors is very diverse. It includes men, women, children, adults, people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds with different languages spoken, documented and undocumented individuals. So it really paints a broad picture of who can be impacted. And the next slide. So just generally, again, kind of keeping it high level, one of the things we wanted to look at is, what are we doing as a state to find labor trafficking? We know that it is often really hard to identify because it can be hidden in plain sight to the untrained eye. You might not know it if you see it. And it can occur in homes or businesses that otherwise would be legitimate. Although it also can happen in illicit industries. In our work, we really were focusing on labor trafficking in industries that the state has a role in regulating. We found many obstacles to finding labor trafficking, and I'm sure that in your states, there probably are similar challenges. So the first really was that we lack an aggressive coordinated state response. We have state agencies that have authority to prosecute labor trafficking, and we have many agencies who might encounter labor trafficking unknowingly in their day-to-day work, but we don't have any agency that's mandated to investigate labor trafficking. No one's responsible for looking for it. So that's a huge gap. Next, we have little training and awareness available generally for labor trafficking. So while we might focus on, human trafficking courses or offer human trafficking courses, often those emphasize sex trafficking and neglect this other piece. So there's an opportunity there. But especially for the individuals in state government and other local government who might encounter victims in the course of their work, we're just not offering specific training for them so that they know what it looks like and know the warning signs. We also have our government agencies often work in silos. They know what they're doing, but they might not know what their colleagues are doing. So what we see is that, and that's particularly true at the state level, at the local level, we see pockets of innovation, and particularly DA O'Malley and the LA team will talk a little bit about some of their collaborative work that they're doing to cross bridges at the local level. But at the state and state government, we don't have that hub to coordinate government and other efforts. We also are not leveraging the data that we have. We've heard from investigators that they might stumble across labor trafficking, but we're not proactively looking for it. And there's data sets out there that can help us find it. So we have from the federal government, there's data on worker visas. There's data from the US Department of Labor, OSHA data, wage and hour compliance data. All of these tools could be used to cross-reference for vulnerable workers to maybe help us identify hotspots and direct some resources and interventions to those industries or areas. In California at the state level, we have our Employment Development Department, which collects data on various industries, regions, and wages. And again, we could use that data, not necessarily to find labor trafficking specifically, but we could help use it to find vulnerable workers and then target efforts in those areas. How amazing would it be if we could create a threat assessment by industry and really proactively use those tools and that data to look for labor trafficking? And then finally, the last challenge that I'll highlight here is that in California, we really put the onus on survivors to come forward and report their experiences and their abuse. Many of them have legitimate reasons not to. They might be afraid of retribution from their employer. They might want to just move on if it's something that they've escaped already. And they might have past experiences of bad interactions with law enforcement or government officials that just make them not want to interact. And so for various legitimate reasons, cases might go unreported. And okay, let's go to the next slide. Similarly, we found a lot of obstacles to prosecuting case labor trafficking in California. The cases, unfortunately, so to date are extremely rare. We have some data on the criminal cases that come through California's courts. And so of those, I can share with you between 2015 and 2019, so a 5-year period, there were 650 individuals arrested on California's criminal penal code statutes related to human trafficking and labor trafficking specifically. Of those 650 people, 145 were convicted of labor trafficking crimes. But when you average that out, that's really only less than 30 a year, less than 30 convictions a year. At the same time, we know that there's this pipeline of hundreds of labor trafficking survivors, and that's just at the very low end of our estimates, hundreds of labor trafficking survivors turning up all over the state. So there's a huge gap there between the people who are showing up having experienced this and our response through justice, through the courts. So why is this? Again, survivors might be reluctant to participate in prosecution. So that's a barrier that we're going to have to overcome. Investigations of labor trafficking crimes can be time-consuming, complex, really expensive to investigate. We heard some really compelling stories from prosecutors about the lengths that they had to go through to understand new aspects of law, labor code, and really figure out how to apply state statutes to these types of crimes. And they often did this work on their own. There are not a lot of resources. We also know that with labor trafficking, it can be very difficult to prove in court. The crime does not require any sort of physical violence or physical force, but not everybody understands this. And then proving cases without this physical element in court can be very challenging. Another obstacle is that we have this civil enforcement tools, but at the state, we're rarely using them, if so far not yet. In 2016, California authorized its Department of Fair Employment and Housing to pursue civil enforcement of our labor trafficking codes. We have not yet done that. We do have the State Department of Justice, which pursues the criminal cases. But on the civil enforcement side at the state level, we're not using those tools yet. We don't track how often they're used at the local level, but again, the team that we have today can talk to you about their innovative work at using some of the civil codes to go after labor trafficking. So again, there's also a lack of published case law in California about how to use our state laws to enforce our labor trafficking. So we have lots of resources for prosecutors about sex trafficking and how to use our laws to combat those types of crimes, but there isn't a parity here for labor trafficking. And finally, we found that cases can just fall through the cracks. They often, a tip for investigating a case might come up in one department and get passed along to another. Perhaps it even makes it to a prosecuting agency to pursue in the courts, but we're not tracking this chain. And so we don't know if cases are getting referred up and then back down or what's happening to them. We're not coordinating among the relevant investigating and prosecutorial agencies. So we just don't know what's happening to cases. So next slide, please. The more challenges that we identified, these are highlighted in the third report that we produced. This is really, we know very little about the specific types of help that labor trafficking survivors need. We know little about what works best for them in terms of care and service delivery. We just haven't studied, their needs. We haven't studied what's effective. So it's another data gap or knowledge gap for us as a state to understand what is the best help that's going to be most effective for survivors to move on and regain control of their lives after this type of experience. Another barrier is that we do have services that we offer to human trafficking victims, but they're offered in a patchwork across the state. We don't have a centralized referral tool. So victims or their advocates who are trying to help them might really have to hunt down information to find out what's available. We don't make it easy. So that's another barrier and opportunity for us. And the next slide. Finally, just to highlight some of our recommendations from these reports, we suggested that California create an anti-human trafficking council. This really is to coordinate efforts of all government agencies and non-GOs and NGOs, around combating all forms of trafficking. Addressing labor trafficking would be a key part of this effort, but really it would be the hub for all of these efforts in the state to come together and coordinate around data collection, around best practices, around education and outreach. Be a centralized point of contact is something that California is missing. I just want to note that we really look to Colorado's Human Trafficking Council as a model here. So if you're interested, I would suggest reaching out to the Colorado team. So other recommendations, we really need government leadership on this. We need agencies like our labor department to take the lead in investigating labor trafficking and be responsible for doing that work. We need training, not just for general training and awareness, but we need training for people who are first identifiers to recognize the signs of labor trafficking and know what to do when they encounter it. And this could be folks who are inspectors in our healthcare facilities or who are going into our bars and restaurants as part of our alcohol and beverage control department. These folks need to know what labor trafficking looks like and how to respond. Similarly, court personnel and law enforcement need training to understand how we can use our state laws to respond to this crime. We need to be more proactive in our use of data, as I described, instead of just stumbling on it. We need to use the data that's available and proactively target our resources and look for trafficking. We need to do a better job of tracking our enforcement activities so that we know what civil cases or criminal cases are moving through the courts, tracking cases through the investigation stage and through the courts, so we know that we're not just passing them around or skipping over cases. And we need to do a better job of understanding what's working and what's not, so that we can start to build best practices and share that information. And finally, the commission suggested that we need to do a better job of collecting and evaluating data on what works for survivors, because we want to first and foremost make sure that the people who have endured this type of abuse are getting help that's valuable to them. And part of that should be making a one-stop directory so that we don't have to have our advocates and our survivors hunt for help, that it's easy for them to find and access. So those again are just the high-level recommendations. I'd recommend looking at our reports for more details. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to turn it over now to my co-panelists to share some of their work. We'll begin with DA O'Malley, and then after these wonderful presentations, we'll have we'll do a discussion session with everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Tamar. It was really excellent. I want to start by just making a few points. We look at labor trafficking in my office as first abuse, then on the scale or the spectrum, abuse, exploitation to slavery. And we've seen so many examples of slavery, but what we have discovered, and this is not a surprise, is that this is a crime that is hidden in plain sight. So there is labor trafficking happening all around us in restaurants and other types of industries, which I'll talk about and Tamar touched on. And so it's important that we pay attention to our surroundings and be more educated. So for all of you participating in this conference, thank you for doing that. Because until the community recognizes and says no more, these types of exploitation or abuse or just slavery, human slavery, are going to continue to exist. As I was saying, on the spectrum, we look at beginning with wage theft all the way down to human trafficking. People think trafficking means you have to move somebody around, but that's not an element of the crime. It is just taking people at that, modern day slavery, as we call it. And Tamar is correct that a majority of the resources and the focus has been on sex trafficking. In my office, since I started the our unit, which I think was the first in the country for a human trafficking prosecution unit, we've prosecuted over 800 sex trafficking cases. In the labor arena, we're probably hovering around 50 or 60. So we have a lot of work to do, but it's very complicated when we're talking about the trafficking of human beings. In California, in 2005, before 2005, there was not even a law regarding human trafficking. They did not recognize it. And my first case happened in 1997 when it was a sex trafficking of a minor. And so we've been working very hard to make sure that our laws are appropriate. In 2005, they passed a very generic law that had no teeth to it. We tried every year, we went back to the legislature to create stronger laws, and we were not successful until 2012 when we created an initiative. And so in California, the voters can create their own law. If it qualifies to get on the ballot, then it's generated by the community, not by the legislature. And in 2012, we were able to create a very strong human trafficking law, and then we've been building on that ever since. One of the things that I will point out is that in Oakland, which is where I'm primarily located, Alameda County, that we see a lot of individuals from Los Angeles, and I'm guessing that Los Angeles sees a lot of people from Alameda County. Next slide, please. So what we know about human trafficking is that it's the business of stealing freedom for profit. I mean, that's plain and simple. The traffickers' methods on how they are able to lure somebody in to a trafficking situation is they can trick them, they can defraud them, like just flat out lie, use physical force to, again, lie about what the situation is. They're being brought in one industry, but then turned into a slave in the labor field, and one more, and threatened. And this is really a very important component to recognize the ways in which traffickers are able to lure someone into that environment. Because when we are able to separate a person away from their trafficker, generally by putting charges against the trafficker, we have to be very mindful of what the needs are that that individual has. Because if we have got to be able to provide the basics of life, for many of these people, they're held in slavery, which means that they're, they might be in a room with 20 other people, but it's a room. And I'm not saying, and there's no way is that ever acceptable, but when we separate people away, we need to be mindful of what their needs are so that we can accommodate them and not drive them further into the distressful life that they have. And we found also that if a business is breaking the laws in one area, they're pretty sure breaking the laws in the other area. We used to call it the Al Capone going after human trafficking, because Al Capone, who was responsible for murders and all sorts of terrible things, was only convicted on tax evasion. So we always look where is it that they are breaking the laws, so that we're hitting them from all angles. And sometimes we look at these cases, the way we identify the labor trafficking is through looking at them from other types of fraud that are going on. The more, I will say that the more the community knows what labor trafficking is and understands the dynamic and can recognize it, the more we will get to a point where we will start to prevent human trafficking from happening in the first place. Because as I said, it is a crime that is hidden in plain sight. And not all people who are being trafficked actually recognize their circumstance as being trafficked, as being held in slavery. And so the more we do, and I'll talk about this in just a second, the more information we get out to the community, the more awareness that we're putting into the community about what labor trafficking is and what it looks like, the more people can come forward and be courageous enough to step up. We do have partners, as Tamar said, and one of our most important partners is the Department of Labor, both at the federal level, though we don't see them very much, but at our state level, because every state has their own labor department. Here's one way in which we partner with our labor department. They have the ability to go into workplaces and look to see what the work conditions are. For law enforcement, we need a search warrant, or we need some kind of probable cause to go in. So we can't just go into private businesses, but the labor department can. And that's often when they send their people in, they're assessing the situation. One particular case that really highlighted this for me is it was above a restaurant, but labor department went in to do an hour wage theft complaint. And it turned out that all the windows were blackened. There were about 150 sewing machines, inches apart from each other. and nowhere was there one person. So we could have never gone into that upstairs, but when they did, then we were able to put the case together criminally. And so those relationships with other industries are critically important, as Tamar was talking about. I will say that one area that is a little sensitive is working with immigration with HSI and those that have on one side of the house is the enforcement, but people don't always know the other side of the house is the victim services, and victim services through ICE and other organizations, other federal organizations are really focusing and stepping up to understand what human trafficking is and to not automatically take deportation proceedings for somebody who's here without documentation. I think that is one of them for those that are immigrants to our country. That is one main reason why they are reluctant to come forward, the fear of being deported. But we have a lot of tools to be able to work through that, including providing applications with them and signing off on T visas to be able to be processed as a victim of crime, as a victim of human trafficking. But what is really important is that when we go into a trafficking situation, one of the things we have to do is think through the consequences. What will happen after we arrest the person and shut down the business? Where are all these people going to go? And what's the impact on them? And so again, we just have to be very mindful that when we do these types of operations, that we're talking about people who need to have the basic needs of life fulfilled. Next slide, please. Many of the, obviously, you can keep going on this slide. Many of the individuals are working in really inhumane areas. And we do know that we don't have a lot of data around the cases, as Tamar referenced, but we do know that this criminal industry that denies freedom to over 24.9 million people around the world. And now in the United States, we have had every single state now has had reports on trafficking. More sex trafficking, but what we do know is more likely that labor trafficking is more prevalent than sex trafficking. It's just hidden in plain sight. Next slide, please. So we look at these forms of exploitation with labor trafficking in the center. We look at workers' comp fraud, and that's one way where we do have the ability to go into businesses and to look at their records. And if they have employees, are they paying workers' comp? Are they paying the right amount of workers' comp? That could be worker exploitation, or it could be labor trafficking. And as I'll explain in one very quick case study, we look at whether or not the individuals are paying income tax or payroll taxes, or are they not giving a full wage? And so those are all the areas that we're looking at when we go into a case. Next slide, please. We also have, we put up signs everywhere to let workers know what their rights are. This notice is poster size, and it really needs to be in multiple languages, because we have the people in the workforce whose primary language, or maybe their only language, is not English. Next slide. This is one of the other posters. And again, we believe that the more we get the information out, the more the public can recognize what trafficking looks like, the more people who are being trafficked can see themselves in this environment, the more likely they will come forward, or people will come forward. The janitorial services is one area that we've given great focus to, because janitors work when people aren't around. And so we looked very closely at this when we had children that were being brought from Central America and placed with host families in California, and I assume other places. But for us, we were checking with the schools to make sure those children were actually in school. And what started us was that one child kept falling asleep. And when we actually, through the teachers and other people, we started talking to the child. And it turns out the child was being forced to work every night as a janitor. And that was a 4th grader. And so we're very focused on those kids who were brought here from other countries and placed in homes for care, to make sure they weren't being exploited. But you can see all these different types of industry where we have seen labor trafficking happen. Next slide, please. As Tamar touched on this, and I put an asterisk next to every type of industry that we have had cases, which is essentially all of them. And there are more than this. These are just ones that we give more focus to. In agriculture, we see more in Central California where there's a lot of fruits and vegetables and agricultural work being done. But even when you look at manufacturing, construction, hospitality, you know, when you walk into a nail salon and wonder, is everybody being paid what they're entitled to? Do they have workers' comp? Are they following the employment rules to make sure that this is up and up? And, you know, once you become aware of all this, you start looking at all of these, you may start looking at all of these industries a little differently and a little more closely to make sure that we don't have exploited people or exploited workers being used here. And I especially give a focus to massage parlors, which I will talk about in just a sec. Thank you. Next slide. So here's a very quick story. This is the first case that I did, which was in 2004. This was brought to me by the labor union and the contractors, because there was a particular contractor who kept getting all of the jobs because she was underbidding everything that all these other legitimate contractors. So they suspected something and they sent workers in, and it was a non-union environment, but they sent union people in to just check out the situation, talk to some of the workers. All of the workers spoke Cantonese, and almost none spoke English. There were 45 Asian males that were working. They were forced to keep, because they were a government contract that you have to turn in your timesheet under penalty of perjury for how many hours people worked and what you paid. So what they did was the workers were required to keep 2 time cards. One was a lie that the employer was turning in to get paid. The other one was minimal. So instead of getting their $25 an hour, they were getting like $5 an hour. Instead of having workers' comp as a person who was doing construction or roofing, they were being paid as somebody who was, the janitorial work, which is substantially different in price, how much workers' comp is for a person in a high-risk job versus someone who's not. They were underpaying the workers' comp. They weren't paying the taxes. And this was a woman this construction company that was very lucrative. So what we did was we went in there, we started working with the workers. We held in California. Once we identified them as a case, we were able to seize all of their assets. Well, at least we froze all those assets. And when we froze the assets, that meant she did not have access to her money, but it also meant that we needed to make sure that the workers had somewhere to go, and which we did. We talked to each of them. They wouldn't talk to me because it was, from a cultural standpoint, it was very, at first I was the prosecutor and a woman. And so we brought in 8 people in my office, inspectors, who spoke their language and came from their countries. And as soon as they started talking to someone that looked familiar, they sort of gave up everything that was happening to them. And they kept a lot of the records and things like that. End of the story is that we prosecuted successfully her. We seized everything that she had, because everything that she had gotten was by ill-gotten gains. We were able to house all of the workers. In fact, we created the first house in California for males who are victims of labor trafficking. So we would have a place for them to be, and food and the basic needs of life, because people will put up with a lot to just have a roof over their head. And so at the end of the day, we paid back the state $1 million for what she had not done. We were able to give every one of those workers their rightful amount of money. I handed checks of $45,000 to these workers, which was remarkable to do that. And that we started looking at all her other industries. And that's where we found the sewing machines, and we found all the other things that she was doing to exploit. So we can always come at it, not just from labor trafficking, but from all other types of violations that they're doing. Next slide, please. So this is just a quote that when this was in 2004, when people didn't even talk about labor trafficking, and we're barely talking about sex trafficking also, but we were dedicated to making sure that's okay. We can, just that we will vigorously prosecute those that are these unscrupulous employers. And trust me, when we took everything that she owned, including her house, her cars, her business, everybody got the message that you better watch out. Next slide, please. Another case study, and this is more prevalent than I think we do believe, and that is that with brothels. So we do have women that are brought here for legitimate reasons from other countries, like to work in a legitimate industry, but it's a scam, and they're taken and put into a brothel and held in slavery. So not only is it sex trafficking, but it's also labor trafficking. And we also always want to address both of those areas to make sure that we are capturing everything that we can about what this employer or what this exploiter had done. And that way we're able to, again, we are able to seize property, we're able to take their bank accounts, we're able to provide the income to people that have been exploited. We're able to provide housing and other resources through our victim witness program. And it's, for me, it's very important that when we see all these different types of crime, that we address all of them. Next slide, and then we'll just go through these next ones pretty quick. So we have an advisory board, which is the equivalent of our task force. We're an advisory board because we want to have people come and be able to be part of this without, well, we just decided we'd do it as an advisory board. There are about 50 members now. It includes both a sex trafficking people that are working in that industry as well as labor. Next. Our labor task force, you can see it's very vibrant. We have multi-agencies. I think this is critically important. Many people who are being trafficked in the labor environment will go to a legal aid or go to another place where they can get help. And it wouldn't even occur to them to go to the district attorney or to go to the police. And so by having these trusting relationships that we've all formed, and I know Los Angeles is quite remarkable in this area, that we are able to share data, share information, so that those that have the authority to address the issue can. Next slide. This is actually what guides us now. This is our artwork. It's actually about 6 feet by 4 feet painting. It was, we did it as part of a call to action by the Office of Victims of Crime to have a piece of art that it's called Representing Resiliency, because we do believe that everybody has the right to their springtime. So our theme is that no winter lasts forever and no spring skips its turn. And you can see at the bottom, her hands start with chains, but turn into flowers. And, you know, our goal is to always give people their springtime, to let them know their darkest days don't have to end at that point. Next slide, please. And that beautiful artwork is posters, and they're all over the county. They're on billboards, they're everywhere, so we can educate people. Again, another public awareness campaign. Of course, the month of January, we celebrate the entire month as Human Trafficking Awareness Month, not just a week or a day. And that we have billboards. We share our billboards with any community. I was in Texas one year and I saw one of our billboards in Texas about human trafficking. And so we just changed the phone numbers for where people can call if they recognize something. Next slide, please. I think that our colleagues in the city attorney's office might speak more about this, but there's a law in California that was SB 1193, so that's why we call it this. And what we did was we created an app that shows the law. First of all, says there are several types of businesses that are required by law to post a poster. And the poster basically gives the basic facts of human trafficking and the phone number where people can call. It's for people in the community to be able to recognize, but it's also for people who are being trafficked to recognize their victimization. So this app allows us to put all the licensed businesses in. And if I go to a restaurant and I don't see a poster, then I can push on the app, push on that restaurant's name, and it sends an alert to my office. And then my inspectors go out. And in California, the first offense is $500. I think I have this right. The first offense is $500, and every day after, it's another $1,000. So it's very important for these businesses to have these posters up. I have, there's so many businesses, but actually I have a group of retired nuns. I don't know if nuns ever retire, but these are a bunch of older ladies who are nuns, and they do this out of the goodness of their heart. And one of them shared with me, it was the first time in her life she had ever been at a bar. Now she goes to bars all the time, she says. Next slide, please. This is our human trafficking poster, which again is the MAP 1193, SB 1193. It's got too much information, but it's what the statute requires. And these are there are certain businesses, and I know LA is doing exactly the same thing. Next slide, please. And I will say that anything that we do, we make available to anyone, any other community or anyone else. So one of our initiatives has been through our HEAT, we call it HEAT, Human Exploitation and Trafficking. And HEAT Watch is actually a 5-prong blueprint on how communities can build their efforts to combat human trafficking in their community. So one of the things that we, as Tamar pointed out, we have a lack of resources in some of these areas. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're taking our cause to, for us, Sacramento, and to the United States Congress to say, we need more resources for this. And one of the ways we're doing that is to get as many clicks of people who stand against human trafficking. So we can go there and say, 1 million people agree with us that we need more resources. And so if you're so inclined, I invite you to go heatwatch.org and just click. We don't keep email, we don't keep the addresses, we don't keep phone numbers. We just want the clicks to say, this is how many people have stepped up to let you know, elected officials who have access to the money or those decision makers. We need to let you know that we care about this and we want our community to be safer. Next slide. Thank you.
All right, now I want to turn it over to the Los Angeles team on if you are ready.
Yes, good morning. My name's Truong. I'm the supervising attorney for the Sex and Labor Trafficking Unit. And with me are my colleagues, Deputy City Attorney Rena Shahandeh and Cindy Martinez Lewis. So I want to first thank Tamar and the Little Hoover Commission for their tremendous work in a short period of time, how deeply they were able to dive, and also how just broad they went. They were able to connect all these individual silos that Tamar mentioned and try to bring that spotlight onto labor trafficking and really get people together. We were happy to host in LA to get those conversations, but really for Tamar and the commission to thoughtfully go through that, listen to everybody, and synthesize it in the series of reports is wonderful work to advance this conversation. And also thank you to DA O'Malley. Clearly, as you can see, she is a leader, and I wish all the DAs in California would be copies of DA O'Malley. I think this work would go smoother. But just to give a little bit of an origin story, we're the city attorney's office. So I think most people would be like, what are you doing with human trafficking? That's a felony trafficking, criminal prosecution. We're done. You don't have a role. So if you don't know, our city attorney is Mike Fewer, and you know that answer would be unacceptable to him because he would be, and he did basically say, you go out there and be a problem solver and make an impact. And this is an important issue. So what can we do about it? And so that was the genesis of this this unit. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting things is we thoughtfully created the name to include sex and labor trafficking, because even at that point we realized when you're talking about sex trafficking, law enforcement was very familiar with being able to take vice operations and that type of enforcement, and they tweaked and they changed their lens to focus on sex trafficking. So that was an easier transition. But labor trafficking was something that really officers had no idea even how to investigate. Did it require paperwork? How do we go about deploying people? And so our role was really try to highlight the labor trafficking portion. And of course, because we're in human trafficking, we follow the 4 Ps. Actually, it started with 3 Ps framework. I think it's 4 Ps. There's some suggestion there should be 5 Ps, but we'll go through, and this is going to be a pretty fast overview, but just kind of the scope of what we do. Next slide. All right, Cindy, take it away.
Very quick overview of some of the projects that we have been working on or have worked on under the prevention prong of the 4 Ps framework. And that is what D. O'Malley mentioned, the human trafficking poster earlier. So the Today Show segment, a World Journal, so you can see that. The human trafficking posting project, which is in the next slide, you'll get a sense for like what our work with service providers, and some volunteers. I don't think we had nuns, but we had a series of other volunteers that worked really diligently with us we created some advisory letters that were sent out to those businesses that had to post. So along with the letters, we sent the poster, and I believe on the last round, we sent over 1,000. So that is on the next slide. You'll see those numbers under the human trafficking poster. The other project, which is on the next slide, is the MSNBC Today Show segment. And for this, you'll see Panida. I urge everyone to, when you have time, to go back and click on it and watch it, because talking about hiding in plain sight, this gives you a really good sense for what that looks like. And you'll see Truong was interviewed, as well as Panida. They talked about some of the population with the Thai immigrant population with the Global Horizons case, highlights Polaris's work. And the great thing about this is that it was featured on the Today Show, but also available on their streaming platform. So at this point, I think it's well over 5 million people who have had access to watch this. And through the collaboration and efforts of our partners in our labor trafficking subcommittee, we also were able to get this piece translated and published in a brand in the World Journal, which is the largest Chinese language newspaper in the US. And I think really the largest outside of China. So again, our efforts, we are a team of 3, a little mighty group that could, can, and does, but obviously we don't do it alone. So part of the work is to collaborate and to reach out to all our partners to be able to get the word out and expand our eyes and ears, which you will hear a lot of that today. And on the next slide, we talked about the podcast actually that Anna and Rena were interviewed for, and the focus is on labor trafficking, again, bringing the highlight to that. Why is it so difficult to find? And again, because we are such a small group and some of the work is outside of our either jurisdiction or the resources, what have you, this is our way to really get the word out there as much as we can. So the work is here for everyone. There is a ton of work for all of us to do. And there's absolutely no reason why we need to sort of, be limited by either a jurisdiction. I mean, yes, we have to follow that, but you have to get creative, and we have to figure out what are the ways that we can get out there and make noise and get the right people out there to, if it's something that we can't do, then at least expanding on that information to everyone. And so the podcast is actually through the Global Center for Women and Justice, as you see that. And if you have not checked it out, I highly suggest that you do. It's amazing work being done. And you have a great host of speakers that come on, and the topic is, they're amazing. So please do consider checking that out. And on the next slide, you'll see also, and I feel like I'm rushing and I apologize. I just want to make sure that we cover as much ground. Under the protection prong of the 4-piece framework, our unit also handles all the SB 823 vacatur petitions. As I think you noted either in the bio or the beginning, that it was mentioned that An was one of the first to go before the court on some of these. Rena has really just taken reign and just presented a lot of great training opportunities for folks, because we thought it would be something that it would just explode and everybody would really hop on it and try to do more of this work, but it's been slow coming. So we're hoping that more of that work can build. On the next slide, you see a little bit more information about the vacatur petitions. And one great thing that has come through out of that is our SB 823 working group that basically brought together service providers, court administrators, prosecutors' offices, and through a lot of work and figuring out people's schedules. I think it took over a year, but we managed to actually get now one courtroom in the courthouse for all LA County petitions. And please, Rena, correct me if I'm wrong here, but now everyone is able to file in one centralized location. It's been a lot of work, and I know our service providers want more, and we want more too for you. But to the extent that we're able to create the space and make it as easier, I suppose, as possible, that, we'll do the work that we can to make that available. Another project, and I believe I'll mention this, is on the next slide. It's a Project Beacon. Project Beacon is a pre-filing diversion pilot. It's post-arrest pre-filing. It launched in June of 2019 as a pilot program, and we work alongside LAPD and our service provider, Journey Out, who sets up an amazing, again, like us, it seems like they have loads of folks, but really they don't. They just have really hardworking, big hearts, incredibly talented service providers that some of them, like the crisis team, are actually survivor advocates. So they get to sit at their station and one-on-one meet with these folks as they come through. And the highlight or the main point is to try to identify victims of human trafficking. Now, anybody who's done any of this work knows that isn't necessarily an easy task, and folks are not as willing to always self-identify or even know yet where they stand. So that is our goal. Our goal is to provide services and make available for people that have been trafficked. But if they're not yet ready to self-identify, that's fine too. These services are still available for anyone who maybe want to leave the life. So Journey Out works with these individuals through the crisis team one-on-one. They are then hooked up with a case manager who spends the time, and they work, if it's housing, if it's emergency housing, hopefully sometimes they also need assistance with long-term housing, food, clothing, whatever it is. I mean, these women, mostly women, will go above and beyond to make those links for them. The other piece that we also came up with, and really Rena came up with through a lot of good work and good context, is on the next slide, and it is our Project Sustain, which is a career and education program for victims of human trafficking. Now, currently, this is being used in linking it up with our Project Beacon, so mostly for our sex trafficking victims, but it doesn't mean that it can stop there. We're hoping that through EWDD and all our other service providers, that this is also something that can expand into and be used by our survivors of labor trafficking. So it doesn't have to be one thing. It can actually expand and be used for more. So this is a great also program that is a direct handoff from case managers. And there's actually a really great communication system, and they've created some direct pipelines where, rather than having, oh, here's a piece of paper, go call this number, it isn't like that. There's a point of contact that they know who to go to. And they've made it even easier at times and say, what time do you have a bulk of folks at your offices? Let us come there and help out. So, we don't want to re-traumatize folks, so we make it as painless and as useful as possible to get the most out of it. So again, I just blurted out a whole bunch of things, but please feel free to contact us if you have any questions about what I threw out there in our slides. And I'm going to hand off back to On to talk about our next prong, which is policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. So the third prong is policy, and I'll just briefly touch on legislation. On the SB 823 vacature petitions, we worked with the Judicial Council on trying to work through some of those very complex jurisdictional issues. And internally, you have to remember, we're part of the LA City Attorney's Office, a huge office. So a lot of times it's just trying to get the right people in place to make sure that we're consistent in how we approach things. So that next slide, please. So specifically on legislation, we worked on AB 2212, which added to state laws this concept of human trafficking that's subject to property nuisance abatement. So if you look under Penal Code 11225, you will find that section. And I'll go into a little bit more depth in later slides. But AB 630 was also a very clear signal that the state didn't preempt all human trafficking legislation or enforcement, or basically occupied the field. And so what we wanted to make sure was that we were not limited as a local municipality from enforcing or going ahead with our own human trafficking laws. And so once AB 630 passed, it actually prompted us, our city council, to immediately create a new municipal ordinance on hotline posting where we have our own remedies that we can pursue. This also sparked the LA County folks from to kickstart their own ordinance. And so after a year, they were able to pass a new county ordinance on human trafficking, which is actually even more expansive than just hotline posting. And that was the point of AB 630. It was to kick the door wide open. And it wasn't just about hotline, it's human trafficking. And it preserves the rights of local municipalities to do and craft their own ordinances. And AB 629, this was something that we supported, but basically it's the Human Trafficking Victims Compensation. So there's a Victims Compensation Board that traditionally rejected claims from human trafficking victims because they needed certain forms of documentation or proof of lost wages, things like that. So this is not a direct thing that most people think about, but it's been significant because victims of human trafficking are now able to seek compensation as a victim instead of being kind of foreclosed from that opportunity. Next slide. So the fourth prong that we get into is prosecution. And so like I started in the beginning, if you were a city prosecutor, you're limited to misdemeanors. Human trafficking is a felony. So a lot of times you look at that and you're like, okay, we're done. We have no, prosecution prompt. But I want to talk about civil enforcement. So next slide. One of the things that we do that seems to be pretty unique, not many other offices, even I think, engage in civil enforcement. We're aware of, for instance, the city of San Diego, city of Oakland. There's a few municipalities that have some experience with this. But as I mentioned, Penal Code 11225 is titled the red light abatement, which is kind of the classic prostitution. But really, after we added 22, the human trafficking abatement law to it, 11225 includes human trafficking, all forms, both labor and sex trafficking, into the nuisance abatement law. Business and Professions Code 17200. And I know I'm talking to lawyers or other people, or if you have law enforcement partners, keep telling them to look at it. It's the unfair competition. And even amongst lawyers, when they think about that, they said, oh, that's unfair competition. One competitor engaging in shenanigans that, don't make it competitive for other people. Well, that's one prong of 17200. The other one is unlawful business practice. And that's the prong that we use, unlawful. So if there's human trafficking at a property, we can say, yes, 11225, and then 17200 is on top of that. That's that'll be the secondary cause of action. And it gives you much greater injunctive relief. And then of course we have our local municipal code section. So that's another cause of action that we can proceed on. Next slide. So just to give you an example, we've sued motels in the past for human trafficking, and we were able to get remedies that you typically don't necessarily think of. So instead of just focusing on jail time for the traffickers, we let the DAs handle that. So the DAs handled the criminal proceedings against the traffickers and got jail time. We focused on the property. So we sued the motel owners, we sued the property owners, and we were able to get them to change their business practices. And that included how many security guards they had on site, what's the coverage, are they armed, are they unarmed, what are their duties? In one situation, we required them to put a security booth in the parking lot because so much of the activity occurred in the parking lot that as soon as they put it in, neighbors called us and said, thank you, because we're seeing cars approach, see the security guard booth and turn around. And that stopped a great deal of illegal activity from occurring in the first place. We required the motels to really beef up their surveillance system so that they couldn't say they didn't see other things going on in the property. We required them to redo their guest registration procedures. And this is before Backpage got taken down. We blocked their patrons from using Backpage. And of course, we were able to, whether it's through judgment, in this case, we were able to settle it for $250,000. And if their victims are found, we can figure out a way to get the money back to them. Unfortunately, in these cases, the victims are gone by the time that we're done with our litigation. So in one case, we're able to redirect those funds with the court approval to 3 local service providers, victim human trafficking victim service providers. So these are just some ways that I think should be part of the discussion, and we throw it out there as a larger discussion of, don't think about just criminal prosecution. Definitely do that, but there are other things that you can do. Next slide. And again, here's a couple more things. If it really gets bad, we can ask the court to close the property. Of course, that's not ideal because, as we mentioned, sometimes you want the business to keep operating. If they're, I mean, not the motel, but a massage parlor, to make sure that there's still, payment going to folks, and not just kind of inadvertently just shut everything down. But we do get permanent injunction, property improvements, these other things. Next slide. And then I'm going to hand it over to Rena to talk about our labor trafficking subcommittee.
Thank you. If there's one thing that I think has been repeated more than anything else in this presentation so far, it's collaboration. You've seen that we are a group of 3, and we've accomplished a lot, but we can't do it alone. We've accomplished that in collaboration with a lot of other people. The LA Regional Human Trafficking Task Force is a multidisciplinary group. It consists of law enforcement at all levels, federal, state, local, service providers, administrative agencies. We have Department of Labor that's been hugely instrumental in developing strategies, as well as just participating in information sharing. We have private industry leaders who participate in the subcommittee that we chair. These include both people who ensure clean supply chains. They monitor the supply chains in industries like the garment industry. Also people in industries that need to provide targeted training to people who work within the industry, such as hotels and common carriers, things like that. We also work a lot with academics and economists, and we have a number of universities that we work with, as well as you'll see in a later slide, we have NERA Consulting that we've worked with, who do economic analysis, and they're all doing this free of charge. This is a labor of love for a lot of people. Next slide, please. We have a couple of basic tasks that we try to accomplish as a task force, or as a subcommittee of the task force. One of them is that expansion of eyes and ears, involving all the different people who might see labor trafficking in the course of their duties or their lives. Another aspect is strategic training. We want to make sure that people who might encounter labor trafficking have the knowledge of what the signs of labor trafficking are, and what they can do about it, how they can address it, who they should report it to. So we have conducted, looks like, I don't know how many trainings exactly, but we've reached over 1,500 participants, presenting to various cities. We have our own city, Los Angeles, Azusa, Santa Monica, Torrance. We've done cross presentations to the U.S. Department of Labor. We presented to the County Department of Consumer and Business Affairs, and other task forces like the New England Coalition Against Trafficking and California State Joint Enforcement Strike Force, which includes the Employment Development Department. Next slide, please. Finally, something that I get really excited about is the use of data, and Tamar really kind of touched on that. But we've been working to figure out, how do we get past the problem that if we rely on victims coming forward, they may come forward 10 years after the fact, when they've become stable, when they've received the appropriate services. We may not be able to prosecute even a civil matter, depending on sort of how the victim feels about the process and the remedies. So, so how do we systematically use the data to detect labor trafficking and really focus our energy on preventing trafficking where it's occurring, as well as identifying victims so we can get them stable at an earlier point? So we've worked with, again, a number of academics and industry leaders and law enforcement and administrative agencies, as well as victim service providers who are doing both legal and social services, to identify what are the red flags that that might indicate there could be labor trafficking, even if they are not in and of themselves definitive of labor trafficking. What kinds of patterns are we seeing? And so we're looking at case studies. We're hearing from DAs and law enforcement, what kind of cases are out there. We've been working with heat mapping, geographic mapping of labor code violations and services, and trying to figure out where are the services concentrated and where are the violations. And a lot of times those two things don't go together. We're looking at pricing studies, which is, we've looked at this in the context of garment manufacturing. Garment manufacturing is unique in that the price is not determined by the cost of producing the garment. It's determined by the price for the finished garment. It's determined at a later stage. And the Department of Labor has done an amazing job figuring out how much a garment has to cost for it not to have been produced by some kind of wage and hour violation. So we're looking at that and potential uses for that to detect labor trafficking at its source. And we also are looking at labor trafficking as an enterprise. We're modeling it as a criminal enterprise that begins in the international context, begins in the home country. And we're really only seeing the tail end of that enterprise. We're seeing the exploitation at the level of the employment, but we're not seeing the recruiting. We're not seeing any of the violations that preceded it or the stages that preceded it. So we're trying to look at this in a more holistic way so we can identify people who can spot labor trafficking at an earlier stage and prevent trafficking in the first place. So next slide, please. So this is just a rough collection of the data projects that we've done. The first was a collection of client intake data from CAST, the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. They worked with NERA Consulting with anonymized data from client intakes for a 10-year period. And there were approximately 500 labor trafficking cases. And as a subcommittee, we were a little astonished that only a handful had ever made it to law enforcement. And we wanted to figure out how can we do something about that? How can we address all of those cases that never made it to law enforcement, where there was no accountability on the part of the trafficker? So, so we took a look at that data, and we already had the enterprise model sort of in mind at the time, and found that it was completely consistent with the criminal enterprise that we had identified. The other studies we've done, CAST and NERA also collaborated on an agricultural study that did a heat map analysis of agricultural industry and its violations. Our office worked with the UCLA Luskin School of Public Policy, and they did a study on the LA region and also did mapping, and they uncovered the lack of services in areas where trafficking or at least wage and hour violations were occurring. Cal Poly Pomona currently is working on a follow-up to that study, and we've also worked with Cal State Fullerton, and they're studying labor trafficking in Orange and Los Angeles counties. I'm going to turn this back over to An.
Okay, thanks, Rena. And I'm looking at the clock, and I think we need to wrap up. but I want to share with you this slide, which is a summary of where we started and where we are in terms of the labor trafficking subcommittee. So take a look at that. Hopefully we can come back on the panel discussion to talk more about. But this to me is the benefit of having a space dedicated to labor trafficking discussions, where you have a kind of a diverse group of participants. So this is the summary slide. Next slide. And this definitely I want to come back to, and it's the question of what is justice for the victims, and reframing prosecution, not as the sole thing that you're looking at, but as a part of the full range of remedies. And so I want to also come back to this slide, but I wanted to just flag that it's here for you later. And if we can hand it over to Panida. Are you ready? Go for it, Panida.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. Super excited to represent the victim slide. And that was a perfect transition on, because we're going to be talking about some victim services during my presentation. So for those of you who haven't heard of us, the Thai Community Development Center is a Los Angeles-based nonprofit organization, and we serve the greater LA area. But because of our human rights advocacy work, we've actually served victims of human trafficking all over the United States. Most of the human trafficking cases that we work on are actually victims who are foreign nationals. So we look at human trafficking from a slightly different perspective, because we do follow the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, federal definition of human trafficking. Next slide. The Thai Community Development Center's mission itself is to advance the social and economic well-being of low and moderate income Thais and other ethnic communities in the greater LA area through comprehensive community development strategies that include human rights advocacy, affordable housing, access to healthcare, promotion of small business, neighborhood empowerment, and social enterprises. Thai CDC got started on working on labor trafficking very, very early in the movement with the 1995 El Monte garment slavery case. And as you saw in the previous slide, we were founded just 1 year before that in 1994. Next slide. Now, a lot of what I do at Thai CDC is both meeting the needs of the victims on the social service end as well as legal services end. In the social service end, we look at the basic needs first, and many of the victim services funded by organizations like ours are actually funded by the federal government. That's also one of the reasons we use the federal definition of human trafficking, but we have to cover food, shelter, and clothing. But outside of that, to make sure that our victims are able to become independent and live sustainably, we also look at their other needs like family reunification. Because of the threat of the traffickers in their home country, their families might need to be brought to the United States. Mental health, ESL classes, job training and placement, immigrant integration, know your rights education. Just like DA O'Malley said, many victims don't self-identify, and that's a huge learning curve for a lot of folks who have accepted their lot in life, which is a very cultural kind of idea for Thai victims, where they accept that whatever's happening to them now, it's because of something that had happened previously in the prior life. So this is a huge thing for us to have to educate that they have certain basic human rights, get them to the point where they're empowered and can speak out for themselves as well as for other workers. And a lot of the times what helps is knowing that they are helping not only themselves, but other people that might find themselves in similar circumstances. And lastly, we also help them open bank accounts, have access to banking, because they definitely need that to survive. And a lot of times when they come from another country, they don't have a credit system. They haven't been introduced to using banking resources before. So that's one of the things that we also want to focus on. Next slide. We also have a legal unit at Thai CDC, which I think usually case managers will connect their clients to legal service providers. But to have it all under one roof has been phenomenal because we save a lot of time. We build the relationships with the survivors, and they're more forthcoming from the get-go to talk to us because they know that we're not just a trusted community resource, but we have the legal knowledge and know-how to get them what they need. If it's immigration services, we work with our law enforcement partners to get the continued presence. There's an open investigation or prosecution that's ongoing, a T visa, and then adjustment of status after their case is closed or after the 4 years, and then eventually naturalization. So these trafficking cases, these are long-term relationships that we have with clients. I have clients that we still communicate with from the El Monte garment slavery case that are naturalizing and becoming US citizens, or they have other legal issues that they come to us for because we're the trusted community resource. And they also refer other victims of trafficking to us because they've been educated on what human trafficking is in the United States. And advocacy in a criminal setting. So this is something that's very important because a lot of times victims are afraid to come forward and speak to authorities. And I don't think this is just a cultural issue because, you know, it can be very intimidating, especially not knowing the court procedures. They themselves think they're in trouble when they're going to be witnesses, but in fact, we're trying to help them. So I think it takes a lot of trust building and just kind of being there and hand-holding throughout the entire process. And if they don't have one point person that they can turn to or trust, it's very difficult for them to actually come forward and choose to, you know, re-traumatize themselves with whatever has happened. And then also civil cases. And I think a lot of civil prosecution is not being done. And it's, you know, it's also about the money. You know, if we can find the money, you know, we can find attorneys that will go after those companies. I think one of our great partners is the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, in the Global Horizons agricultural labor case. We're still distributing settlements from farms that had profited from this slave labor. So, you know, just yesterday, I was wiring money to Thailand because we finally located some of the victims that went back to their home country. But, you know, even though they left and we're still able to find them, we can still send them the money. And I think this is just one piece of the puzzle that makes those victims whole again. And of course, the U.S. Department of Labor has been a phenomenal partner. Sometimes the U.S. DOL, they can just do things. And I'll talk about it a little bit more in one of the case studies that I have coming up. Next slide. So working with government agencies. Now, with the reporting to law enforcement, so this is the thing. For victim service providers, it's always the option that's given to our clients, whether or not they want to report. But to be eligible for a T visa, they have to report and collaborate and be willing to collaborate. And so this is something that's kind of ingrained in the way the TVPA is set up. So if they don't want to report or collaborate, then they will not be eligible for continued presence, a T visa. I've had cases where law enforcement basically said, well, they weren't that forthcoming, so we're not going to give them CP, even though they wanted to report. So, you know, there's a little give and take, and I think it's really important to maintain relationships with law enforcement partners to kind of understand where they're coming from and what they need. And aside from that, you know, law enforcement partners rely on Thai CDC and service providers to make claims on behalf of our clients because, you know, I work with a population of monolingual Thai speakers that would not be able to submit their own claims. So we're able to grab those victims and fill out paperwork for them and send it in so that the claim is actually in the system, and we're able to help, you know, with translation or a meeting place. And a lot of times victims will not want to go to a law enforcement agency's office. So it's really nice to have that kind of middle ground for everyone to come together and understand what's happening and what's going to happen. Now, I think it's really important to understand that victim services are available primarily through the federal government, through the Department of Justice, Office of Victims of Crime, and also through a per capita program, the TVAP program, where victim service providers, once they are subcontracted, can provide those services. We also work very closely with the International Organization for Migration to assist with the family reunification. So once our principal victim receives a T visa, their derivatives, their spouse, their children, or other family members that are being retaliated against are able to come to the United States. And so this is a piece of the puzzle that I think is very important because we want to keep the families together. And when we see many migrants who come to the United States, they've been away from their family for 6 years, for 10 years without actually seeing their children grow up. It's phenomenal, and it's also heartbreaking when their children actually come to the United States to start life anew. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, Thai CDC has been working on trafficking since 1995, and we've had multiple labor trafficking cases that are group cases. And I think this is particularly unique for the Thai community because of the vulnerability factors of Thai people. So I just wanted to let you know that even though we have a lot of group cases, many labor trafficking cases are not group cases at all. Many of them don't go reported, and I'll be highlighting 2 smaller cases that are ongoing. But here we've worked on the El Monte case, which was garment slavery, and we had a domestic workers case, and that was actually about 4 victims who were working in the residence of a Thai elite. And then a welder's case where there was a DOL case. There was a $1.4 million settlement against Transbase Steel. And as far as I know, I worked on the resettlement of these welders, but I learned over time working on this case that they actually worked on the Bay Bridge in California. So that was really surprising to me that labor trafficking, it's not just in our backyard, but it's like right in front of us sometimes, but people don't know that. And then, of course, the Global Horizons agricultural labor case, which at that time was the largest case of human trafficking in US history. And that's a case where there were over 1,000 victims. And we know that because of the numbers of H-2A visas granted to the Global Horizons firm, the recruitment firm at that time. Okay, next slide. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the Asian Pacific Islander Human Trafficking Task Force. And this is a victim service provider led task force, which I think is very different than many of the task forces around the country. We're actually not funded as a task force, but we did receive funding from OVC to provide specific services in 2016 to 2020. I'm actually going to drop the website into the chat so that you could check it out. And in the website, there's our brochure in about 7 different Asian languages. And this is one of the ways that we try to reach both people who are victims themselves and also people who might be able to refer victims. Because of this collaboration between these organizations, including Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team, Legal Aid Foundation, Pacific Asian Counseling Services, and others, we were able to provide multiple services in language, including legal services, case management, mental health. I think one of the things we did was raise awareness, but we also trained our sister organizations to be ready to serve victims of human trafficking. And even though some of these organizations have already served victims of other crimes like domestic violence, and there is some crossover, it's very specific when you serve victims of human trafficking in both the sex and labor context. Okay, next slide. Here, I just wanted to show some demographics. We did do a final eval for our 2016 to 2020 grant, and these are the countries that were served, the countries of foreign national victims that were served. And you can see here the highest amount came from the Philippines, and then Korea, and then Thailand. And we did serve folks from other countries too, because we serve everybody, although we did focus on API countries because of our language proficiencies and cultural competencies. Next slide. And then you can see here, so this is, both by sex as well as type of trafficking. You can see that most of the victims that we had served are female and labor, which is somewhat surprising because this conference is about labor trafficking, but I've been to many conferences where it's all about sex. So it's really interesting to see the crossover, as well as the fact that the females are also victims of labor trafficking. Next slide. And then here we are with the different settings. So this is real data for the clients that we served 2016 through 2020. And you can see that a lot of labor trafficking is going on here in the hotel motel area and also in private homes. And then down here we have the agricultural sector and then restaurants. So we have a few here and there in the other sectors as well. Next slide. So these are two cases that I would like to point out because they're very recent. They actually happened during COVID. And when COVID happened, I think all of us had to pivot because many services, many referrals weren't possible, and many people switched to an online kind of remote working situation. But we found that human trafficking still persists. So in about July of 2020, Thai CDC was referred a case where two victims of domestic trafficking were being held in a residence in the San Marino area, near Pasadena in the LA area. And what happened was, although the two workers came to the United States willingly, there was some visa fraud because they were actually supposed to be doing different work than they were actually performing. And one of the workers eventually could not contact their family members back in their home country. So their family members were concerned and alerted their local NGO in Thailand, who then referred the case to CAST because they're in the know. So they knew CAST, and then CAST contacted Thai CDC because these victims actually came from Thailand. So in this kind of a case, we found out that not only were the two victims working in the home, but they also worked at a family-owned restaurant. So they were being brought to the restaurant to do restaurant work, cooking in the kitchen, not being seen because they didn't speak English, so they couldn't work at the front of the house. And then when they went home, they had to do all the domestic labor, the cooking, the cleaning, the child care. So they were pretty much working all of their waking hours. And then, they shared a room in the house in this pretty affluent area. And at that time, once we were able to locate the clients, it was really key for us to coordinate with law enforcement. And I'm just going to give a shout out to Paul Chang. I know he's on the webinar too, because he definitely helped to navigate, even though he wasn't on site, because the local police department had to be on site. And also we coordinated with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. And Thai CDC does focus very heavily on with the Homeland Security Investigation team because we do want to request continued presence right away. We basically want to make sure that those victims who are coming out are going to have resources available to them. So we were able to do kind of a concerted meetup nearby, and we were able to go in together. And I was on site to explain to the victims once they had been extracted what was happening. because I know it could be a very scary time for them. And the fact that they had multiple officers on site, both the PD as well as the HSI, kind of ensured that no one was going to run. But at the same time, we did face barriers because one of the victims actually did not want to leave. They were told, so not the one who couldn't contact their family, they wanted to leave. Their phone was taken away, their passport was taken away. They wanted out, but they had no way out, right? So we were able to take that person out. The other person, unfortunately, due to other cultural barriers, stayed in the situation because their family back home, who they were sending money home to, who they relied on, told them to stay right there and stay put. And this was really difficult for us, even though we explained to them that they have certain rights. But a few months later, they actually contacted me and wanted out because they weren't getting paid. So it's just hard to stay in a place where you're supposed to be supporting your family and not get paid. So once the money stopped, because the money was already slowing down during COVID, there were restaurant closures and all kinds of layoffs and things. So initially the trafficker was paying their charges, not what they reported to DOL when they brought the victims into the country. They paid them their Thai wages, which is less than minimum wage here. But eventually that money stopped anyhow. And so the second person contacted me. And it's also very important to keep those channels of communication open, because the only way that they could contact me was on Facebook. So they actually found me on Facebook. They messaged me, and we had, because they can't read and write English and I can't read and write Thai, they actually called me a few times, and I was able to coordinate a pickup. And that was the one where Paul Chang went to meet, to make sure that we could get them in the right direction. I have to say there was an investigation, but there was no prosecution. The DOL started an investigation and negotiated the wages, and the wages were paid almost right away. And I think it was because the trafficker was afraid that their immigration status would be revoked, and they wanted their children to come study in the United States. You know, there are all these other outside reasons, but the wages were actually negotiated by the DOL right away without the victims having to go to court. And they met with us at Thai CDC. DOL came, brought them the checks, and it was actually really fast and really clean. I was so impressed. But that's not happening in all cases. And the second client who had escaped didn't have her passport, and so she lacked her own identification. She wasn't able to open a bank account, and so I put the FAST program down here because the FAST program is a way that trafficking victims can actually open bank accounts through banks without having their ID, as long as they've been screened and identified and referred by victim service providers. And the second case I wanted to focus on is this Florida case. And this is a case that came to Thai CDC because of the Thai community that had reported it. So it was, the whistleblower was a massage parlor worker who saw the abuse happening at her workplace. And in that case, we were able to coordinate with HSI and the local police department out there in Florida. It's really hard to coordinate a case across the country. But we were able to do this with the help of Catholic Charities, who provided the emergency housing and case management. And we were actually able to find Thai language mental health services that was located in the state of Hawaii, but got the emergency license to practice in the state of Florida to provide weekly therapy sessions to the victim. And unfortunately, this case also was not prosecuted. There was an investigation that was open. And, you know, Thai CDC has worked on a lot of cases, and most of the cases, I have to say, that were prosecuted are those larger group cases. And so I don't know how it was, the decision was made, but this person is still kind of in limbo because there were other types of lawsuits that were filed against Catholic Charities by the trafficker. It's a very complicated case, but we were able to find legal assistance in the state of Florida through Florida Legal Services. And then Catholic Charities has an immigration lawyer. So it's really about everybody kind of coming together and making a concerted effort on a case-by-case basis, because every case has very different and specific needs. Not all cases want or need mental health, but this case for sure is the crossover between domestic violence, because the trafficker was the mother, and the victim also had some mental impairments. So it's a process to kind of explain to people who start in different places what their rights are and what is possible. This case is currently being being referred out so that they could receive culturally competent, linguistically competent services in Los Angeles. So we're actually accepting a referral from Catholic Charities in Florida and bringing this person to the Los Angeles area to receive services here with the help of CAST and other service providers that are on our team. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that was the end of my presentation. But before I end, I also wanted to share an issue of the Archives of Criminology that came out earlier this year that focused on labor trafficking specifically. I did co-author an article on there that focuses on trafficking from Thailand, including the Global Horizons case. So if you are interested, please go ahead and take a look at that, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, Kristen, if you could take down the slides for now. So what I'd like to do now is open it up more to a group discussion. I think you've all heard what amazing work these individuals are doing with their very small teams. It's really just quite phenomenal, and something that our commission drew a lot of inspiration on as we were thinking about what the state of California should do to improve our statewide response to trafficking. I think some of the questions and comments that have come up in the chat and the Q&A so far have really revolved around this idea of collaboration, whether it's sharing resources or working together. And certainly that was a theme of all of these presentations today. I think you heard over and over again that we can't do this work alone, and we do need to work together. So all of the individuals today are part of collaborative efforts. And I wanted to just dig in a little bit more of the how-to. I know this is something that is hard to get started, but what does it take to establish a formal, regular place to meet and hold these conversations? And how have you benefited from those collaborative efforts? I think that might be helpful for some of the folks in the audience to hear a little bit more about.
I'll start. So, for the first thing for us, for the labor trafficking task forces, we had to start building the trust between the community-based providers and the DA's office. In some of the labor trafficking cases, we do follow the same thing that the city attorney does, which is use our civil remedies. But I think that a lot of that was just building the credibility that we are as committed to protecting victims of labor trafficking as all of our community-based partners and organizers. And so I think that once we started having the small meeting, it grew and grew and grew. And now the labor trafficking has about 45 members. And we co-chair both the labor trafficking task force, and then I chair the advisory board, which is much larger and incorporates the different task forces. So building trust with the different communities and different community providers was critically important. And one of the ways we did that pretty quickly is that we got a referral and we investigated and prosecuted the offenders. And that let our partners know that while prosecution is not the only remedy, the fact that we responded and that we're serious as they are, that has taken us a long way.
Yeah, let me jump in if you can hear me. So for us, I think it's the importance of just creating that space and making a regular space. There is no lunchroom water cooler that transcends federal, state, county, local agencies. And so it's really important to kind of just set a space. And I think the regional task force provided the kind of basic framework, but it was the labor trafficking subcommittee. And believe it or not, we started with a 1-hour meeting when we first attended. And it was like most other meetings. People would show up, we traded business cards and said, if you come across this, give me a call. And that was it. And 2 months later, we'd have the same meeting with slightly different group of people exchanging cards. And so when our group decided to chair this subcommittee, we made a very deliberate decision to take it from a 1-hour meeting to a 2-hour meeting. And now that's counterintuitive because most people would say, I barely have enough time for an hour. Why would I spend 2 hours in this? But the 2 hours, and we managed everyone's expectations, this is a working group. This is not a meeting group. This is a chance to really sit down, share your problems, let's work through some things. And so that's what started it. But we realized it wasn't enough just to have our typical law enforcement partners around the table. We really wanted to hear on the ground what was going on. And so let me share with you the screen just to kind of show you. Can you see that? The summary slide? Okay.
We see, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea was basically we started with this frustration from law enforcement saying we don't get any tips and, okay, I guess there's no labor trafficking going on. Once we invited the right people, our victim service providers are saying, oh, we see it everywhere. We have clients coming through the doors. And so that was the beginning of, well, what's going on? And when we were able to have economists and academics join our committee, they were the ones who volunteered and said, I have free time. How can I help? And CAST worked with the economists, NERA Consulting, and we worked out the confidentiality agreements, but they started looking at CAST's database and being able to analyze that. And that's what Rena had mentioned, 500 cases of labor trafficking that no one other than CAST, I think, was aware of, but law enforcement wasn't aware, other agencies weren't aware of it. And that began the genesis of, we need to do more with this. And so I think the question was what's going on in the gap? And it was this focus on criminal prosecution is not the end all be all. What else is going on with all these other available remedies? We next went into this visual mapping, and this is where Paul Chang, I know he's on this call. He should be part of this presentation. US Department of Labor, awesome partner, but Paul really spearheaded this visual mapping of this enterprise. 10,000 feet level, you will all see yourselves on this map, except law enforcement, which is actually off the map because we're not even a part of that chain until so late in the game. But that drew us to this systematic detection, and Rena went over sort of these studies that we've had. But where we are right now is basically for all the work that we've done, for instance, in the LA region, we have a huge group of Chinese immigrants, and they are a very close-knit community. And yet we looked around the table and not much outreach was being done. Not many people understood what was going on. And so there's a discussion about what is the specialized targeted outreach that we would need in order to reach those vulnerable populations. And that's where we are. And I want to point to our resources page later on, but Mika Garrido from the Cook County Task Force took a huge leap in preparing materials that were contemplated to be used not as are you a victim, of human trafficking, but really, do you know your, as DA O'Malley mentioned, do you know your labor rights? Do you know your other rights? And a way to kind of just connect and build that relationship. The other person that I want to refer to is Rachel Parker of the Triad Labor Trafficking Task Force. She's also on resources page, and I will put a link where she recently did a podcast for Dr. Sandy Morgan. And so definitely everyone look at that, because she is doing the work that we are all talking about. How do you reach vulnerable populations? How do you target your approach? How do you build the trust? Sometimes it's with law enforcement. Oftentimes it's not with law enforcement. So how do you get that done? So those are the resources I would send you to. But those are, Tamar, the benefits of creating this space that people feel like they're not wasting their time, that they just spent a good 2 hours getting something out of it. And so that's what we are trying to do, and we're going to try to keep that going.
And one thing, just to build on it, one thing we certainly heard from our hearing process and the meetings was folks coming up to us afterwards saying, we had no idea that there were other people in this city or that city working on this. And now we're able to share resources. And so we had, prosecutors from one county in the Central Valley, talking to prosecutors in the Bay Area and in the South, sharing strategies and tips. And they had never connected before. So I think creating those spaces is really something that we took away as a message of being very beneficial. And I do just want to reiterate for everybody, we did put together some resources, which we will make sure Kristen has and the ASU team has to share with everybody after this. So all of the contacts that An just mentioned, including Paul's contact information, Paul, just to let you know you're on there, and DA O'Malley's contact information, because I know there were some specific questions about Heat Watch and some of the other efforts, the reporting efforts that you all are doing in Alameda. So we'll make sure to get that contact information out. I think another area that kind of came up today, if we have time, Kristen, maybe for at least one more, is just this idea of building trust and really finding innovative different ways to seek justice for victims. I think An, you mentioned this, it's not always prosecutions, and Panida, in your work too, it's not always prosecutions, although I do think learning more about where we are finding success in the courts is very helpful. But what does it mean to work with victims successfully, be victim focused in doing this work, and what does that take? Because I think that that was another theme that came up through our work, looking statewide, as something that we need to be very cognizant of as we're setting up state structures and responses to labor trafficking broadly. How do we incorporate the victim focus from the very beginning?
I would kick this to Rena to do, but and I'll share this slide. But basically, we're not taking credit. We were really prompted in this direction from Dr. Sandy Morgan, who we mentioned runs the podcast Ending Human Trafficking. But it's an important question. It really, I think, allowed us to kind of think beyond our traditional prosecutorial roles. And so let me show you the screen, and Rena, if you want to just give us your thoughts.
Sure. I think this is a question that should guide us all the time when we're thinking about potential remedies. A lot of people think, okay, this is a violation of law, we should criminally prosecute. What we really need to be asking is what remedies are available to make the victim whole, at least as another question. Criminal proceedings are one way, and there are victims who, I'm sure our victim service providers will correct me if I'm wrong. There are victims who want criminal proceedings. They want their traffickers prosecuted, but there are probably many, many more who just want to be made whole and get on with their lives. And that can take many forms. It could mean a civil case where there's restitution ordered. Could be administrative proceedings or administrative remedies where they also get back wages. We heard about Department of Labor negotiating wages. It could be they just need support to get on with their lives, or that's ancillary to other needs that they have. That's why we work so much with people who provide housing, and why it's so important for them to have social services available, and for social services and law enforcement and all these agencies to work in tandem. T visas are a huge issue. We see this over and over again. Trafficking victims can get visas to stay in the country, and we need to work with our victim service providers who do legal services and make sure that they have what they need to pursue that remedy. Vacature, we talked about that. Right now, we see vacature in the context of sex trafficking in prostitution cases mostly, but vacating criminal convictions could take a lot of different forms. You can imagine a labor trafficking survivor who was forced to do things that were violations of criminal laws, and vacature can help them clear their records. There's always going to be a need for employment if you're displacing someone from, I hate to call it a job, but an employment situation where maybe they are making some money. Where are they going to be employed after that? We need to provide employment services. and I already touched on restitution. So there are just so many needs that we need to address, and criminal prosecution is just one piece of that. And we really need to kind of reframe our thinking.
Yeah. And
Can I just add to that, if that's okay? The one thing is that many victims don't recognize their own victimization. And so, you know, the state of California at least has laws like the posting, the signage and things like that. But we do a tremendous amount of outreach to the community. And I will tell you that what has really made our task force so effective is that we have all different nationalities represented and people that speak multiple languages. And so I know with that first case I talked about with the construction workers who all spoke Cantonese, I had an interpreter and I was trying to explain to the big group and it was completely flat. I mean, there was barely a reaction. And then we took a break. I realized, you know, let's take a break. And I had my inspectors there who were all from China or Hong Kong or spoke the language. And I walked out the door and it was like flies on the picnic basket. People will respond to someone that is familiar to them. So as part of the task force, we're very purposefully reach out to various and diverse communities to be part of the task force. So anybody who comes through the door may very likely see somebody who looks like them or some, you know, that we're working together. We know who's the right person to reach out. But I just can't overemphasize enough that our outreach is a great door opener for people to recognize their victimization and to also understand that it doesn't mean prosecution, it doesn't mean deportation if they're here without documentation. There are so many different remedies which Rena just went over. But we need to let people know that because people don't know, even our colleagues don't know. And so we're constantly training, constantly reinforcing, constantly doing PR campaigns, things like that.
thank you. I just want to make one point. In everything that we're doing, our office has taken the victim-centered approach, but the last year and a half have really, the world is turned upside down with everything going on with the pandemic and the protests and criminal justice reform. I want to make clear that in some ways, victim-centered is important, but I don't want to be in a point where we're saying, stop doing prosecution, stop supporting law enforcement to do the investigations. I think we're already seeing fewer and fewer resources devoted to law enforcement. So we are hurting on that end of things. And I'm not saying stop prosecution at all costs. Really, there is prosecution, but look at all these other available remedies. It really is the full plate, and not to focus on one at one extreme at the cost of the other. So I just want to make clear that that's where we are as an office.
Panida, I wanted to give you the opportunity to jump in on this too, because I know we spoke throughout our study, so many times it was emphasized that generally we need to do a better job of making sure that we're interacting appropriately when we're working with victims or with survivors after the fact. And just the importance of building bridges with community organizations that can facilitate those conversations between service providers and law enforcement and survivors. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to sort of best practices or what that might look like.
Sure, and I would definitely applaud on for calling out the victim-centered approach, because it's super important to talk to the victims and find out what they want, because every victim is different, and it's not for us to tell them this is what has happened to you and this is how it's going to go, but what is your goal? What do you want to do? Do you even want to stay in the United States? Because some folks are like, no, I need to go home and take care of my elderly parents, and it's not exactly what we expect, but at the same time, I think Rena had talked about the criminal prosecution, and I have to say many API victims do not want to prosecute because it goes against their religious beliefs. They don't want to do bad to other people because it'll just come back to bite them. They are very fatalistic. The goal is really to get over and overcome all of these terrible, terrible things that might have happened to them and move on, find a way to make money, find a way to support their families.
Thank you. Kristen, do we have time for one more, or do you want to do a time check here? One more question. I kind of want to just open it up to everybody for some last thoughts, some sort of future thinking type questions. That was a lot of what our reports were about, future thinking for what we could do for the state of California in terms of addressing labor trafficking. And I guess, so I'll just throw it out to all of you. If there was, one big change that you would like to see for California forwarding its work on labor trafficking, what would that be?
I'll start. I think that financial investment by the state of California is critically important. We've put in Los Angeles, the city attorney, and under the leadership of Mike Pure in my office, we've taken our resources and redirected them from other duties. And so I think that that's one area is to by recognizing it and by demonstrating, as the Little Hoover Commission did, that it really puts the burden on the state of California, or any state for that matter, to invest the resources so that we can actually do the work. And we're not doing it on a shoestring. And I don't mean just like us that are in government service, but all of the service providers that work with individuals. And I think that that's an important outcome of the Little Hoover Commission and all of our work.
I think for me, I would second that. Basically implement the commission's recommendations. I do believe it's not enough to kind of say, we need a coordinating council that's still out. You need to fund it. You need to create that space. You need to assign people. You need to create a system that outlives, a particular elected official, or, that's great that Rena, Cindy, and I get to do this, but I fear the day that we are not assigned to this work, and who else is going to take it over. So really, I think get that set. And I think it does take the financial commitment, but it takes that recognition. So I applaud the commission for raising this. I really think it's the legislature and the governor's control, and it's up to them to really take the next step. But I think it would be great to establish a statewide kind of lens, instead of us, informally reaching out to each other, breaking down these silos. There's, for all the great work that's been done, look at all the other folks who are not at the table. And so for me, I think the vision going forward is further collaboration. We need everybody.
And I just wanted to add, it would be great if all of these wonderful resources were available to victims and you didn't need a go-between, right? So in California, we have victim compensation. Why do you need a lawyer to fill out that paperwork, right? The victims should be able to do it for themselves once they find out about it. But also, and that also speaks to like language barriers and things like that, to make it available in multiple languages and readily accessible. And also, those foreign national victims that we see in California, they do need immigration status. And I can say that I have, after working on human trafficking since 2007, I've actually never received a T visa certification from a California agency.
I'm going to third all of the above, but also I think it would be really useful to have a more robust system of data collection and analysis. We're gathering our data really piecemeal from individual agencies, and I think there needs to be a more systematic approach to that.